What's up, boys? This is going to be the first module of the series of how to kill your old self and actually align yourself with the version of you who's 10% body fat. The version of you at 10% body fat is not going to be operating at the same capacity as you are operating right now. Right now, you are operating under the identity of the guy who's out of shape. 20+% body fat, 200 plus pounds, right? The guy who doesn't have a six pack, right? And in order to get that result of being 10% body fat, we have to start operating differently. We have to start thinking differently. We have to start moving in a different way that is going to align with the version of us that we want to become. So step one is we need to just kill our old self. And what does that mean? I want you to take note of the exact way that you live right now, right? How do you live? How do you think? Like, what do you think about on a day-to-day basis? Do you feel sorry for yourself? Do you have this mentality that you don't ever have the capability of getting lean? Do you have these limiting beliefs, right, that you're not meant to get lean, that you don't have the capability to be 10 to 12% body fat? Take note of how you think, right? How do you operate, right? When you go to the gym, right, do you just kind of go through the motions? Do you just kind of, lift some weights here and there? Do you kind of go like 50% effort, 60% effort in all your sets? Do you never train to failure? How do you operate on a day-to-day basis? Do you operate with the most intensity? Do you operate like you want to be 10% body fat? I want you to think about that, right? How do you operate? How do you act, right? What is your mindset in the other aspects of your life? Are you a disciplined person in the other aspects of your life? Do you struggle with lust? Do you struggle with procrastination? Do you struggle with showing up in the other aspects of your life? Because in order to kill your old self and get to 10% body fat, you have to operate with a different standard. Because the version of you who you are right now, this guy right here, who's 20+% body fat, not in great shape, doesn't have a six pack, he is operating under his current state right now, and this version of him has to completely perish. He has to die in order to get that future version of you who's 10% body fat, right? The version of you right now, who you are, is not going to be the same version of you who you are once you get a six pack, once you get to 10% body fat, right? But you need to do some backtracking, right? How do you operate at this very moment? How do you think? How do you live? How do you operate? And how do you act on a day-to-day basis, right? Start to take note of these things, right? Literally, I want you to take notes. I literally want you to pull out a piece of paper and I want you to write things down, right? I want you to write down, okay, when I go to the gym, do I give my full intensity every single day? Do I give it my all? Do I train to failure every single time? When I get home and I make a meal and I think about, okay, is this going to taste good? Or is this going to get me one step closer to having a six pack and being 10% body fat? These are all things you need to think about. And literally, I want you to actually journal. I want you to journal. And I want you to literally take that piece of paper and write everything and every thought that you have in your life down. I want you to take note of all these things. How do you live, think, operate, and act? How do you do these things on a day-to-day basis? And we're going to start to recognize the patterns in the way of thinking that you have right now, right? Maybe you're the type of guy who thinks, I work 10 to 12 hours a day. I don't have time to get ripped. And these are all limiting beliefs that I want you to journal about. I want you to take note of them. I want you to actually think about these things, right? Because before you can actually make the change and actually become 10% body fat, we first have to recognize the habits that we want to kill, that we want to delete from our lives, so that we can actually replace them with the healthy habits of someone who's 10% body fat. Right, so start to take notes, start to journal, and start to actually think about all these things that may be your limiting factors, right? How do you show up to the gym every day? Do you do your cardio consistently, right? After you hit your hard workout, right? Or maybe your 50% workout, even worse. How do you hit your cardio? Do you just kind of walk on the treadmill for 5 to 10 minutes, lowest incline, low speed, 1 mile an hour, and just call it a day there? Or do you push yourself on an incline treadmill at a pretty high steep incline in 3.0 speed, right? These are all things you have to think about. Recognize the way that you live right now. Recognize the way that you act and you operate right now on a day-to-day basis. And we're going to slowly start to recognize these patterns so that over time we can make the change and shift into the version of ourselves who's 10% body fat. So now that you have an idea of like, okay, what your biggest bottlenecks are, you understand and you actually have a journal, right, of the way that you operate right now. Now we have to figure out what's the difference between you at 20+% body fat and the difference between you at 10% body fat, right? The guy at 20% body fat, that kind of looks something like this. It's kind of like what I looked like, right? 20+% body fat. Is he consistent? Is he consistent with his workouts? Does he stay consistent with his meal plan? Does he have the ability to show up every single day, be consistent, regardless of the result? You have to get to this point mentally where you will show up every single day, regardless of the outcome, right? You get to such a place mentally where you become so obsessed with the process every single day that regardless of if the outcome is guaranteed or not, you will show up every day. You will be disciplined. You completely detach from the actual result itself of being 10% body fat, and you focus solely and only on the inputs as to what it takes to get there, and you start to build that consistency, right? The version of you at 20+% body fat, he's not consistent. He works out maybe 1-2 times a week. Some weeks he's not even working out at all, right? Sometimes he's not even doing his cardio, right? He's not consistent at all. And in order to shift into that version of you at 10% body fat, you have to develop this consistency mindset, right? You have to be the type of person who, regardless of the circumstances, or maybe you work, 60 hours a week, 10, 12-hour days, right? You have this idea and this capability to show up and be consistent with your inputs, regardless of the circumstances. It's not always going to be comfortable. It's not always going to be a walk in the park. You're not always going to have all the time in the world, right? When I was in high school, I had time for 3-4 hour workouts. I had time to be there all day because I didn't have that much going on. But once you get to a place where you're constantly working and you constantly have things going on, you have to get to a place where you will show up regardless, right? You may only have an hour to work out, right? You show up and you work out for 45 minutes and you do 15 minutes of cardio, right? You have to have this mentality of being consistent and sticking to it no matter what. And this ties hand in hand with discipline as well, right? Can you actually become the type of disciplined man who's able to be disciplined with his workouts, be disciplined with his meal plan, be disciplined with doing his cardio every day, right? The version of me when I was 220 pounds, he was not disciplined at all, right? He'd go out to eat with his family most days of the week. He'd go out and eat a cake or some ice cream or some crazy dessert, right? He was not the type of person who was disciplined enough to maintain a healthy diet, right? And the version of me at 10% body fat, he is the version of me that is disciplined. He has consistency. He has discipline. He's actually able to be disciplined with everything that he does. He's disciplined enough to say no to the junk food. He's disciplined enough to look at sweets, look at treats, and say no. That's the version of you at 10% body fat, right? These two individuals are always going to operate differently, right? The version of you right now, who you are at 20+% body fat, the version of you who does not have a six-pack is not going to be the same version of you mentally, physically, spiritually, right? The way that you operate and the way that you think and the way that you act, these two versions of you are going to be completely different once you make this transformation. Right, the me at 220 pounds, I was smoking weed every day. I was drinking alcohol 3-4 times a week. I was getting blacked out drunk with my friends most days of the week. I was living out of alignment, right? If I thought to myself back then when I was out of shape, okay, would the 10% body fat version of me be drinking all this much? Would the 10% body fat version of me be smoking this much weed? Giving into his cravings because I would get the munchies and I'd want to binge out on every single food that I saw? Or would he be the type of person who would give up his vices, put himself in a position where he's not going to give into his cravings because he's actually developed a disciplined mindset? And that's the same reason why I cut out all the vices in my life. I cut out the weed. I cut out the drinking. I cut out the smoking. I cut off people who I knew weren't going to live in alignment with the version of me at 10% body fat. I cut off people who hated on me. I cut off people who didn't think positively of me, people who didn't want me to win, people who clowned me when I started my fitness journey, people who thought I was being cringy, people who thought I was being corny when I was starting my fitness journey. I cut all these people out, and slowly over time, I developed the 10% body fat identity, the version of me who is aligned with the version of 10% body fat. And lastly, and most importantly, work ethic. The version of me at 20% body fat, he had no work ethic. And these all tie together. Consistency, discipline, work ethic, they all tied in together, right? You cannot have one without the other. When you have an extreme work ethic, you're willing to show up regardless, right? Like I said, you could be working 60-hour work weeks, but if you still have the ability to show up for yourself every day, regardless of if it's comfortable, regardless of if you even want to in the first place, that is you slowly aligning with the version of you at 10% body fat. Because you have to think, would the version of me who's my highest self with a shredded six-pack and crazy arms, who's shredded out of his mind, would he be the type of person who's going to show up regardless of the circumstances, right? Like when I got broken up with, I had this mentality like, everything's so hard right now. At the time, it was November of 2024, and, I was playing college baseball at the time, and I really didn't want to show up for our workouts as a team. I didn't really want to show up and get some extra, cage time, right? And work on my swing and work on my arm strength and work on myself in all these different aspects, right? Because I got comfortable, right? I got depressed. I got down on myself. And I had to think, okay, would the version of me at 10% body fat let all these external circumstances affect the way that I operate, right? Everything could be going to shit. I could get dumped. All these different catastrophes could be happening in my life, but if I'm still the type of person who's able to operate under the identity of the guy who's 10% body fat, I'm going to keep my physique, right? Far too often, I see guys who, they get lean, right? They get a ripped physique and then they get into a relationship. Then they lose themselves, right? They start eating out all the time with the girl, and they start going to, I would literally go to like movie theaters with girls, eat all the popcorn in the world, eat slushies, right? I was eating Doritos and Sour Patch Kids and all these different foods with girls, and I wondered, why am I losing my physique? Because I was losing myself in the process. I was slowly unaligning myself with the version of me at 10% body fat. The 10% body fat version of me, he wasn't eating out with a girl every weekend. He wasn't doing any of that. Right? And now I look back and I realize the reason I wasn't 10% body fat is because all the other aspects in my life were not aligned. Look at the other aspects in your life outside of just fitness, right? Sure, your meal plan, your cardio, your workout plan, they all have to be dialed in, right? That's super important, right? But at the end of the day, your life has to also live in alignment, right? Are you disciplined in your relationships? Are you faithful to one woman? Do you have the consistency, right, to show up to your job on time every morning, right? All these little things matter more than you think, right? When I started getting disciplined and I started getting to 10% body fat, I started to have more discipline and consistency in the other aspects of my life because they started to translate. That same mentality translated into the other parts of my life, right? When I became disciplined with my eating, I became disciplined with my financials and how I spent money. Right? I became consistent in showing up in my relationship every day for my girl, right? I started to develop the habits of the guy who's 10% body fat, and that doesn't just show up in the gym. You're not just, showing up and doing your cardio, meal plan, workouts, and calling it a day there. Your whole life has to be in alignment with the version of 10% body fat. Do you have consistency? Do you have discipline, work ethic in every single aspect of your life, right? For instance, I used to never get good grades in school. I used to never really try. Right? And now I look back, okay, during the times where my grades were the worst, I was almost failing out of college one semester. I got on academic probation. And I look back and I think about it, okay, what was my biggest struggle, right? I lacked consistency with my academics. I got lazy with it. And because of it, my physique was the worst it had ever been. That's when I was 220 pounds. Because how I did one thing is how I did everything. If I was the type of guy who wasn't going to be disciplined and consistent with his academics, how could I show up with my meal plan and be consistent with my workouts? And vice versa. If I wasn't willing to be consistent with my eating, my workouts, and my cardio, how was I possibly going to be consistent with my academics? And this is the biggest switch that I made, is realizing that the 10% body fat identity is not just about the gym. It's not just about your workouts. It's not just about doing your cardio every day. It's about a full life alignment. A 10% body fat alignment has nothing to do with just the body itself. It has to do with the way that you operate and the way that you come off every single day in your life. It's not just about the body, it's an entire identity. The version of you at 10% body fat is going to be the version of you who's disciplined in the other aspects of your life as well. Start focusing on the other aspects of your life. Ask yourself, am I being consistent with the other aspects of my life? Like, take an evaluation, an honest look at the other stuff in your life. Are you truly being consistent at work? Are you showing up and doing the work that is required of you? Are you showing up in your relationship? Are you showing up for your family? Are you being a leader in your family, right? All these things matter more than you think, and you start to align every single aspect, right? With the highest version of me, who's 10% body fat, ripped, right, and consistent, right, would he be doing all these things, right? Maybe you smoke weed and you drink a lot, right? You have to recognize the fact that the version of you at 10% body fat is not going to operate in that same way. So start to cut out the things that you know are your biggest bottlenecks. Look at the things in your life that you're struggling with the most, all right? And start to pick them apart one by one and be like, okay, would my highest self be participating in this activity? Would my highest self be doing this? Right? And you start to think about it every single day. You start to eliminate those vices, and you start to align yourself with the version of you who's 10% body fat, and slowly over time, you become 10% body fat because you have aligned your entire life. Environment shaping is probably one of the most important parts when it comes to actually being aligned with the version of you at 10% body fat, right? Shaping your environment so that you are in an environment that's going to push you to grow, that's going to force you out of your comfort zone and push you towards becoming a higher man, right? An even higher version of yourself than you are right now, right? Because you could have every single tool in the world, right? You could have every single resource at your disposal in order to get ripped and to get lean, right? But if you're constantly surrounded by bad energy, people who are hating on you, people who are judging you for what you're trying to do, it's going to make it that much harder, and it's going to really destroy you mentally, right? The only way that you ever execute a great plan, right, and actually get ripped is when you are in a good headspace, right? When you actually have a clear mind and you're able to execute every single day and not having people constantly judge you and constantly criticize you for, you know, what you're trying to accomplish, right? So it comes down to just shaping your environment shaping, right? Look at your friend group, right? Start off by looking at, you know, the people that you hang around on a day-to-day basis, right? Look at your friends, right? Your best friends that you hang out with all the time, right? What do these people do, right? Do these people like to go out? Do these people like to smoke? Do these people like to drink on a day-to-day basis, right? Do they partake in inappropriate activities, right? Do they partake in things that your future version wouldn't align with, right? Because when I was in college, right, I was constantly surrounding myself with guys who were drinking every weekend, smoking every night, and I slowly started to become just like that. When I was in high school, I went to one party, I didn't smoke weed, right? And the moment that I get to college, constantly surrounded by guys, you know, on my baseball team who were smoking weed all the time and drinking every single weekend, right? And I found myself partaking in these activities over time, and it was the fact that I was constantly surrounding myself with these guys, constantly their thoughts, opinions, ideas, and slowly I started to morph into one of them, right? In high school, I was a really shy kid. I didn't really go out. I didn't really talk to girls that much, right? And then I get to college, and I'm around all these dudes who are trying to hang out with as many girls as possible, get super blackout drunk, and hang out with these girls, and slowly I started to morph myself into that type of person. Unintentionally, right? You are the average of the 5 people that you hang around. If you're hanging around people who are smoking, partying, drinking, and you're hanging around these people constantly, taking in their thoughts, beliefs, ideas, you are going to become just like them over time, right? So it starts with, okay, distance yourself from these people. I'm not saying you have to cut off your day ones, right? And find a whole new group of friends, but at some point you're going to have to distance yourself from people who you know aren't going to be suitable for your future, right? What activities do they partake in? What are their habits? Are they very disciplined people? Are they people that would align with the future version of you? I want you to think about, okay, the types of people that I would hang around when I get to 10% body fat, when I get ripped, when I get the physique that I want. I'll be hanging around dudes who also prioritize that, right? We as humans, we crave connection with those we are very similar with those we are relatable to, right? I don't relate to, you know, a basketball player because I was a baseball player in college, right? We only relate to people who we are very similar to. I relate to a lot of other baseball players, right? And the struggles that they've gone through, right? So we relate to people who we are similar with, All right, so I want you to think about, okay, who are the types of people you're going to surround yourself with when you're 10% body fat? It's going to be other people who prioritize their fitness, prioritize their health, prioritize their body, their mind, and their physique, right? So you have to think about it. If you're hanging around people right now who don't do those things, they don't prioritize their health, they don't prioritize their physique, their mental health, right? And their physicality, right? You have to think about it, right? Okay, are these people really going to be your friends long term? Right, because some of my best friends from college, right, I just don't feel like I relate to them anymore, right, because I became just like them, right. I became like these types of people who were drinking and smoking every weekend, and once I started to distance myself from that, and I became a different type of person, suddenly I don't relate to them as much as I used to, right. So it gets to a point where you have to understand that your friend group is going to evolve over time, right. The people that you're friends with right now may not be the friends that you have 6 months from now when you're ripped with a six-pack, right? You're going to relate to different sort of people. So it's about shaping that environment now, right? And that doesn't mean cutting off your day ones, right? It means that, okay, maybe you need to distance yourself from them just a little bit more, right? If you hang out with them all the time, right, you start to partake in their activities, right? Maybe it's time to distance yourself just a little bit, right? To shape your environment in a way that is going to be productive for you to get the result that you want of being 10% body fat. You surround yourself with guys who are 10% body fat constantly, right? You surround yourself with guys who have the result that you want. Just like I, surrounded myself with guys who were partying and drinking and I became just like them, you surround yourself with guys who have the physique that you want, who have the body that you want, who have the life that you want, and you become just like them because you start to take in their thoughts, opinions, beliefs, ideas, and you become just like them. It's no different than the negative situation of instilling beliefs and becoming the type of person, right, who parties every weekend, smokes every weekend, right? It's the same thing with success as well, right? You surround yourself with people who are more successful than you, you become just like them, right? So this is the number one thing, right? Do the people that you hang around, do they align with the version of you that you wish to become? You wish to become someone who's 10% body fat. You wish to become someone who's super ripped, right? Do the people that you're hanging around right now align with that? The best decision that I ever made was when I hired a fitness coach my junior year of college. I just turned 21 years old, and I was constantly surrounded by all these people smoking and drinking every weekend, and I knew that I had to make a change. And when I went down the process of hiring a fitness coach, I wanted to hire someone who I wanted to be like, right? I had this fitness coach who I followed on Instagram named Evan, and I loved his content, I loved his physique, I loved his mindset, and I wanted to develop my mindset into exactly what he had so that I could have the same result. All right, so I had this mentality like, okay, if I surround myself with this guy's energy constantly, I learn from this guy, I learn how he operates, he thinks, and he does and goes about his business, I'm going to become just like him. So that's the advice I'm going to give you, right? Start to surround yourself with the people that you want to be like, right? If you want to be, more successful and you want to have a ripped physique, start surrounding yourself with people who you want to be like, people who already have that result. Slowly over time, you're going to suck up how they think and they operate and they move, and you're going to become just like them. That's how you shape your environment. That is exactly how you are going to be able to shape your identity, right? By shaping your environment, and slowly that's going to manifest into you becoming 10% body fat because you're putting yourself in a positive environment. People aren't going to be making fun of you, right? People who are already successful and have a great physique are never going to be making fun of you for wanting to put time and energy into your own body and getting a great physique, right? It all just comes down to surround yourself with people who you want to be like. Surround yourself with guys who have the same, the same habits, the same discipline, everything that you want in your future version of you who's 10% body fat. You start surrounding yourself with them now, their energy, their thoughts and beliefs, right? And slowly over time, that is going to be shaping you into the version of you who's 10% body fat. But instead of waiting for it to happen once you get to 10% body fat, you start taking action on that now, and eventually reality is going to catch up to you, and you're going to be 10% body fat because you've shaped your environment in a way that is going to manifest that result for you.